Hello there, I'm K-Ball, and welcome to Human Skills, where I interview tech industry leaders about all the non-technical skills that go into success in the tech industry. I suppose it's natural that a conversation about managing stress and anxiety turned to feedback. After all, giving critical feedback can be super stressful. But in this conversation with Alan Van Arden, the thing I appreciated most was how often he was able to shift things to the positive, how to reframe stressful situations as normal and manageable, how to invite your audience in when you're having anxiety during your presentation and use that anxiety to create connection, how to handle the emotions when you receive critical feedback, and how to give not only clear and useful feedback, but clear and useful praise as well. Quick note, I apologize for the audio in the first part of this interview, particularly my audio. I was accidentally using the wrong mic. It's still understandable though, and really, Alan is the one dropping all the wisdom, so listen to him, skip past me if you need to. All right, hello and welcome. I am here to talk about human skills once again. Today I'm joined by Alan Van Arden. Alan, how's it going?
It's going pretty well. It's a pretty nice day where I am today, so I had a nice little walk this morning. I was pretty excited to be on the podcast this morning.
No, I'm super excited to have you because we've been having conversations about this topic informally for a while, and I'm really excited to kind of dig into some of your experience and thoughts. But let's maybe start with just a brief history of you, kind of your career trajectory, and how you got to this place where you care about human skills.
So I think that, my career goes back to working on video games, and it was quite technical for a very long time. I worked in games for about 10 years, and then after that, I shifted into web and mobile apps, getting more into the business side of things, and really relearning technology, again, very technology focused. And then probably about 5 years ago, started getting more into the management side. Past sort of the tech lead role and getting more into like how people and teams work together. And where that sort of started to spark an interest for me is when I started working within a client services organization. I worked for a company called The Working Group, which later became a part of Deloitte Digital. And at that point, the understanding of how important people are in that business model really started getting me to understand how to sort of build a high-performing team, how high-performing teams get better at what they do. And so human skills on an individual level, on an interpersonal level, on a relational level, all of that becomes really, really important. And I once had a really smart CTO of mine tell me that even the technical problems are human problems. Ultimately, it's all things we need to do for people, by people, with people. So that aspect is there. And if you want to build good software, you need to have a strong team. You need to have a strong interpersonal skills, and that just makes things better. We produce better code. We work better together. We're happier as we do it. So that was pretty exciting to me, just to understand how we can level up through this whole other discipline that's outside of the framing of technical problems.
Totally. Well, and one of the things you mentioned, so thank you. You talked about staying very technical for a very long time. I think as you start to advance, even within purely technical roles, some of those human skills, and maybe they're more personal skills, right? Like how do I manage my own performance? How do I manage my own stress? What do I do when I mess something up? Those start to be super interesting as well.
Yeah, and I think over that whole technical side of my career, like you're right, all those skills had to come into mind. But there's something that switches when you start thinking about them like, oh, specifically, I could get better at these things. And honestly, I wish I had a podcast like this. I wish I had people talking about that earlier in my career and saying like, hey, focus on these interpersonal skills. You get better at them faster when you do.
Yes, the things we pay attention to tend to get better. Well,
yeah,
that's a nice intro. So where would you start? Now, you've been thinking about this, talking to your younger self. What would you have pointed yourself towards first?
First, okay. Well, that's there's so much, and I think that I think I could probably start with just talking about managing stress. I think that would probably be most applicable to anyone, particularly when you're starting and you start moving into these really big, complex problems. Sometimes they can be quite overwhelming when these projects get laid out in front of you, and you're like, well, I have to do that. I have to build those things. So I think that if people just told me, give me a few really simple tips around how to manage stress and anxiety when working on these things. I think I could have gone a lot further. I think I would have been much happier at work. And one of the things that I really think about is reframing and normalizing, right? So one thing, normalizing that, yes, I'm about to give a presentation in this meeting, or I'm going to run stand up today. I haven't done that before. And knowing that does cause some anxiety, especially the first time that you do that, and that it's normal. It's normal to feel that way rather than getting trapped in the emotion and making that situation more stressful. I would really recommend just thinking that like my emotions are normal, my feelings are normal, and I can move into these situations and still perform well while I feel these things. I think that would have been one really big thing. And then secondly, reframing is also really powerful, right? If you're coming to that big, overwhelming project, it's like, okay, well, this is big. And it's really hard for me to wrap my head around. But if I reframe this and saying this, it's actually a series of really small things. Let's talk about the first 3 small things and only focus on those. And so that goes into a little bit of breaking the problem down. But in the moment, like even before you get into that work, and just know that like this big thing seems undoable. It's overwhelming, but I know that these become smaller things, and I know I've done a lot of small projects, and they've all been successful. So those sorts of things can really help manage stress in those environments. I think that would be the top 2 things. If someone told me that, like first day, first tech job at a university, I would have really appreciated that advice.
I love that. So you're gonna feel anxious. That's okay. That's normal. And when it feels too big, figure out how to break it down. Did I sum those up reasonably?
Yeah, and not just figure out how to break it down, but know that you can break it down, right? Like they're like, and just in that first moment, because of course the work will be breaking things down, but in that first moment, just think like, hey, break things. Like I'm going to be able to break these things down. Like just sort of lower that sympathetic nervous system, calm it down a little bit, and get on with your next step.
I love that. Okay, so you've started with that. You're brand new to the tech industry. Somebody tells you, okay, you're going to be stressed. Don't worry about it. Start breaking things down. Okay, what's next? Now, I know I'm anxious. I get up on stage. I feel normal being anxious, but now what do I do?
Well, yeah, I mean, now what you do, I think like in the framing of you're up on stage and still, you're still kind of feeling it. You're still kind of going through the emotions. One thing is naming it. So like I'm feeling some anxiety. That really helps calm things down. Taking a deep breath, taking a moment. Sometimes the time in a presentation or the time in it always feels like it's much longer than it is. So like take a moment. You can take a moment. People are patient. People want to see you succeed. And sometimes even like bring them in. Like I've actually had some of my stress relieving moments where I take a big deep breath. Sometimes seems like a big sigh. So I like to just bring people into that. So of course it's not misinterpreted as like, oh, this, especially like as a manager, this person's frustrated with me. Why are they sighing? Instead, it's just like, I'm going to take a deep breath, everybody, and just to calm myself down for a moment. Why don't you all join me in doing that? So take that deep breath. All right, and then maybe move into your presentation after that. So simple little tricks to sort of help calm yourself down. Slow down, take a pause, take a deep breath, let the audience in on what you're feeling and what you're trying to do.
Yeah, well, you've just done something very powerful there, which is you've shown some vulnerability, which like we like to think, oh, I've got to be perfect, I got to be up there, but people connect with us more when we're vulnerable. And you just said, hey, I'm feeling some anxiety. I'm going to sit with that. I'm going to breathe. Now they're on your side. Oh, yeah, we want to help him succeed. We want to help him feel better.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a pretty tricky thing to do. Like, being vulnerable is hard. But once you do, you find that there is some connection that you build with people. And connecting with people is actually also a stress reliever. So you can be vulnerable. You see that, people are on your side. That reduces your stress. That maybe even be reducing stress in the room. Aside from a presentation, if you're running a meeting to start breaking down a problem for a feature that you're working on, that can be stressful for other people in the room, right? They're coming in. Maybe they're not sure how to solve it. Everyone's kind of overwhelmed, and you just want to start talking about it. Like, showing that vulnerability kind of brings up the stress of the entire room down a little bit, and then you can get into it, and then you start getting creative. Insights, like all those things start coming easier once you've gone through that process, even though it can be a little bit daunting to do that at first. Yeah, and that gets complicated, and it's definitely a bit of an art. You do need to take a little bit of practice with it. But there's a couple of things that I think you need to know about what stresses people out at work, or in general. And there's lots of things, but I'd like to focus on a few of them. One of them is uncertainty. So when people, like, our brains are prediction machines. So if we can't predict the future, that's a little bit anxiety provoking. That's a little bit stressful. And the other one, which seems related and maybe almost opposite sometimes, is also autonomy. So not necessarily having autonomy. So if you're really autonomous and you don't really know what you're doing, that can also be a stressful situation. But if you think about the situation where you don't know what's going to happen next, and you don't have control over it, that's like a double whammy. That's really stressful. And so, as a manager, understanding those two things are really important. Understanding why somebody might be stressed. And based on the level of experience, if they're maybe more junior, you're maybe dealing more with that uncertainty scenario. I don't know, I haven't done this before. I don't know what's coming next. So really be able to sit with people, help them break down the tasks, not necessarily do them for them, but sometimes you'll have to put in some of the solutioning. But generally, talk things through, okay, here are the things that we need to work on. How do we maybe break these down? Let's talk about what your priorities are. Okay, so we've got about 20 things that need to get done over the next month, but let's only worry about the top 3. Those sorts of things can really bring people's stress level down. And that can happen in a meeting, in a group, in a one-on-one, depending on the scenario, of course. And then the other side is autonomy. If sometimes a more senior person on your team is really into getting the problem solved. Maybe the solution's been prescribed a little bit too much to them. Try to give opportunity to voice opinions, give opportunity to go off and come up with their own solutions. Work in a more autonomous way. That can also lower that person's stress. But it's a balance because sometimes one person might need the opposite from the other.
How do you kind of get a sense for what someone needs there?
Well, I think talking to them, this comes into the environment that you've kind of created as a manager. If people are comfortable talking to you, comfortable what's bothering them, and trying to get a sense of that. You can make some educated guesses. This person's much more senior, they're really stressed out. We can talk to them, hey, what's bothering you? Or maybe make some guesses, do you feel like this project's going the right way? Are there any things that you would change about it? And sort of through that questioning, you can kind of get a sense. But sometimes if you have an environment where people are comfortable talking about how they're feeling and voicing their opinions, and that's a long-term process. You're creating a culture of being able to speak and communicate, and maybe even be a little bit vulnerable. I'm feeling this way because that brings these conversations more into the open. And so hopefully that person will say, like, listen, I don't like, I'm overwhelmed. I've got a lot on my plate. I don't know where to start. Can you give me a hand? You kind of want that environment to start happening. But I understand that you might not, not everyone is going to be comfortable saying with that. So, you have to sort of observe people a little bit. You have to understand where they are in their careers. And you need to be able to ask good questions and situationally observe maybe what's happening, understand what their workload is, understand what they're working on, understanding their previous experience. Like maybe they're working on using a ML model and they're maybe a little bit intimidated because that's not something they've ever touched before. And so walking them through that and seeing where they need help and getting resources. So it's a bit of an art, and you have to get in there, but I think asking the right questions and understanding your team, knowing who they are, where they are in their careers will go a long way in making those decisions.
Yeah. So one of the things you talked about there is kind of the overall team and organizational culture, and that in a higher trust culture, people are more, kind of able to open up about what's stressing them out, what's not, show that vulnerability. Do you have any examples where you've kind of helped move a company towards a higher trust culture that you could share with us?
Well, I think moving towards higher trust is more difficult than it sounds. So I definitely worked with one particular organization where I wouldn't say that they were low trust, but there was less of a sense of autonomy and maybe the team started out to be junior for a long time, and then as they grew, they didn't necessarily grow into a higher trust environment. And sometimes when you're working with a more junior team, you have to really help and be a little bit more prescriptive with the work. And so, like, how to change people, like how to change the culture that they're used to, is a little bit more challenging. And I for the longest time, I thought everybody wants to be in high trust cultures. High trust cultures are great. Autonomy, we're all excited. We're all kind of overachievers trying to do really hard things, and people just want to make their own decisions. And the management problem is to keep people not aligned on business goals and focused and that sort of thing. And that's not true, not in every case. So in some scenarios, you actually find who people have worked in low trust cultures for a long time, you start hitting that uncertainty, stress that I was talking about earlier, right? A lot of people have gained their comfort and certainty by knowing that the work that they're going to be given is going to be well outlined, detailed. They just have to follow a set of procedure, and they get used to that. And so moving someone say, okay, now make your own decisions, all of a sudden with a whole team, even if people have been working under that model for a long time, and the assumption that they're senior and they're going to want to do that is not necessarily true, because you're pushing people into that sort of uncertainty and not sure, something they never had to do before. So in those scenarios, if I were to do some of the things that I've done before again, I think I would create slower introduction of high trust scenarios, giving people more autonomy for very specific things, more hand-holding about, like, instead of being prescriptive in those smaller bite-sized pieces, ask them how they would maybe move through, and just take more time moving into that high trust scenario. And I wonder, I mean, some people don't necessarily want to work in high trust scenarios. So you have to kind of figure out what teams will want as they move through. But I think if you break things down into smaller pieces, find opportunities to give people a little bit of autonomy, push them a little bit out of their comfort zone, and help support through those earlier projects, you can slowly start moving into wider and wider scope on what the team is going to be autonomous over.
Yeah. What about if the company broadly is in this sort of low trust environment? Is it possible to just bring your team along, or does it need that kind of organizational backup?
Well, I mean, that's a pretty broad question, because of course there's some scenarios, you as a manager have high trust, And then you can bring your team into you could operate your team in a high trust fashion, and help sort of isolate them from the wider organization. So even though organization generally becomes more prescriptive, you can maybe come into a scenario where you're operating your team in a more high trust way. And as a manager, I think that's enough to focus on, is like how your team operates. But I think even if you're in a low trust environment, you can sort of take that sort of prescriptive information as a manager, break it down, maybe get your team to look into like different solutions, try and understand the problem a little bit more, see if they come up with close things, and have a high communication with your leadership. That kind of moves into managing up in a certain way, where you're really saying like, okay, well, I understand that we want to take these steps. I still want to achieve the same goals that these steps are outlining, but I'm trying to make sure that the team has the opportunity to solve some of these problems, and maybe they'll come up with something better. It can be a tiring scenario to be in, because you will be always justifying your position in building that. But I think it's possible, and I think everyone's human. Just, even senior leadership in low trust cultures are reasonable people. They want to be successful. You want to be successful, and just remind that that you're on the same page on goals. Making sure those goals are clear, and of course sometimes you'll have to, give in and say certain things will be done a certain way, and that's sort of it. But it's a long term, like changing people's minds, changing people's opinions, changing culture is takes a long time. And you have to sort of put the hours in. You have to kind of build relationships with other leaders, get support in cultural changes, and not expect things to change overnight. Understand that you have to operate under a certain model for a longer time, and slowly bring those changes into light, and get people on board, and get more buy-in across the organization, and that sort of thing. So it does take time, and it is challenging from someone that's just managing a team. Well, not just managing a team, but someone whose focus is managing a team rather than someone whose focus is managing several teams. There's that role authority that helps culture changes a little bit quicker. So influencing up is always really hard.
Do you have any tactics you can recommend to someone, like very concrete things they can do if they're trying in a scenario like that, trying to influence up?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, it's always been having good conversations, building trust with your superiors, understanding, trying to get in line, trying to help them understand that you're on the same team, you want what they want, and bringing that up in conversations in ways that are maybe not too triggering, being a little bit. Being like having those conversations and making sure you're bringing things back to goals that the company's setting, understanding what the company's trying to do, and justifying why you want to do things in a certain way, and slowly over time building trust with your leadership and managing up, and so in a way that helps them bring those ideas into light. It's sort of like a slow burn in conversation, trying to change people's minds, and repetition works a lot. Well, let me talk about that scenario again. Here we'd like to take this on ourselves this time. Last time we didn't get a chance, and we talked about it before, but let's talk about it again, and maybe we can take a small project and let the team work on that, and then you might get another no, we have these different priorities, and you kind of bring that over and over again, and it could be frustrating, but repetition and communication helps people sort of process things. Don't expect answers right away when you have these conversations. As people, we'll take in information, and then we'll process it. The ideas will sort of come through, and senior leadership's always thinking and strategizing. So when you have those conversations, that information that you're bringing to them will help shape their ideas. And so I think that's really helpful. The second thing, like beyond just talking to senior leadership, is getting support across the organization, getting other people to agree with you. So this is where building relationships across departments. If you're a manager, you maybe want to be talking about things with your PM. If you're a senior manager or director, you might want to talk to the director of product, director of design, sort of talk about like their perspective on things. Maybe you'll shift your ideas on things as well and sort of come up with something that's better suited to the whole organization, that gets you the cultural change that you want, but also feeds into things that they need as well. And then having that support, and then of course they will talk to their leadership as well. Can improve your idea, can solidify sort of the more broader understanding of how the organization, like how changing the organization will impact everybody, and just improve your arguments over time as well. So, a company is a group of people. It's not just a manager and a senior leader. It's also it's a group of people that are problem solving together. So get allies, get support, problem solve with other people, get ideas from other people, and sort of shape the thing that you want to change, that in a way that'll work for everybody. And I think that'll go a long way.
Yeah, something that you said a few different ways through there that I really like is you're thinking about, for each of these people you're having conversations with, what are their goals? What are they trying to achieve? So whether you're managing directly up to a senior leader or talking with peers, you're trying to understand what is it that they want? What are they trying to achieve? And how do you shape what you're trying to achieve such that it helps them get there too?
Yeah, and the thing is, it's not a whole bunch of independent people with independent goals. Like what they're trying to achieve is actually tying into a strategic goal. In a well-led organization, your own personal goals should be tying into a strategic goal that the senior leadership has, and try to find out where these goals overlap. And sometimes it can feel like the design goal and the engineering goal is maybe in conflict. But often, they shouldn't be. They should be the same. They should be tying into the same goal. So in those scenarios, really kind of understand what their goals are, understand what your goals are, and how do they connect. And of course, good leadership is communicating their goals constantly and helping you tie in your goal with them. So you might find in like your one-on-ones, like your goals are tying in with your leader's goals, but the cross-team peer communication, like that relationship building, helps you understand how each and everybody else's goals, how they relate to yours and how they relate to the strategic goal. And that's why I say your any cultural changes or process changes or things that you want to move forward at an organizational level will need to be colored by those, because you could be just thinking off in your silo and what could be better for you. But if it's better for you and not working for other teams, you're not achieving that wider strategic goal, which is really important.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Cool. Let's come back a little bit to local rather than the whole organization.
Sure.
And thinking about managing a team or working as a tech lead or something like that. One of the things that you mentioned in a previous conversation you were interested to talk about was feedback. And how do you give effective feedback as a manager, as a peer, those sorts of things. So let's kind of start digging down this train instead.
So I've been thinking about feedback for a long time, and it's super interesting to think about feedback, especially in the context of stress and in the workplace, because feedback is sometimes a stressful scenario, and we can't avoid stress all the time. We definitely need to help correct somebody's performance, help correct our own performance in places where, especially when we're impacting the rest of the company or other team members or something else in a negative way. Those are things that need to be resolved, and often feedback is the route to that. And so, one of the things that getting that, like, dealing with that threat response comes back to sort of the culture, having comfort, open communication, ability to be vulnerable. And the thing that we didn't mention earlier is like trying to build an understanding that that when you get feedback or when you give feedback, it's in the interest of improvement. Really, that's a sort of another way of reframing things. Like, this is, this feedback might feel bad or it might feel a little bit stressful. But my colleague is really trying to help me. My colleague is trying to help the team. Here's some goals that we're all trying to achieve together, and I think this is a way to do it. And so that again helps sort of get that initial response. I think naturally, I did some reading about this recently, and probably misquoting the material, but I think naturally when we get feedback, we kind of see it a little bit as a status threat. Like our status might be changing, like someone's saying something negatively. I was part of this team, as part of this group, everything was going well, and now there's something I need to correct, and that feels like that's a little bit of a status threat. So
feels like an attack. I don't know about
feels
you,
like an attack.
Like, I always ask for feedback, and still, when somebody's giving me critical feedback, like, it's a punch in the gut.
Yeah, it does happen, and I think it's important to sort of have that framing and understand that over your career you're going to be getting and giving feedback, and over time sort of understanding that, like, you might need to deal with these emotions. They will pass, they'll come through, and after that they do, like, have some chance to reflect on what the actual feedback is. So that's pretty. That's kind of like a primer to some of the things that I'm interested about feedback. One of the things that I've always found very useful in sort of like a practical way is, like, when you do give feedback, is to be specific, to, like, very specifically say, hey, when you do this, then this is how it impacts other people, or is how it impacts the situation. And then the second thing is to give specific ways to sort of fix that. So maybe one example is like this when you give large pull requests, it's really hard for us to review them. That can potentially introduce new bugs to the system. What I would prefer is if you would put in smaller pull requests by story, by ticket, of course in functional ways, functional pieces of code, but so that they're small enough that it's easy for other people to review. And then, the outcome of that is that, we'll have better quality reviews and less chance of introducing issues into the system. So that's sort of a way to sort of talk about giving someone feedback. That's like, be specific, outline the impacts, offer a solution. I think that's really helpful. But I think there's plenty of scenarios we'll have to give feedback, give corrective feedback in some way. But one thing that I think that we don't always talk about in feedback is positive feedback or praise. That is super important, arguably even more important than giving constructive feedback. Because the way we work, the way we learn is we build on our strengths. We naturally build on our strengths. So, like, what you want to do as a leader is you try to build the most high-performing team as possible. And that means individuals getting better at what they do. And sometimes people think that that means working on your gaps, or working on the gaps that people have, working on people's weaknesses. But as we know that, like, not everybody's the same, that's not always productive. Of course, someone wants to work on certain weaknesses. They want to get better at something. It's great to help them through that. But ultimately, like, if you think about that team level, you think about people's strengths, and we're really good at, like, getting better at our strengths. And what you want to do is turn people's strengths into superpowers, and then find people on your team, build the team in such a way that people's strengths overlap. Right? And by giving praise, like that thing that you did yesterday, that PR that I reviewed, that code was really good, really clever. Yes, do more of that. Like the underlying message is like, yes, do more of that. And people will be encouraged to learn more, improve on those skills, and, go from, like, strengths to superpowers. And I think that's...
Well, and the same thing that you mentioned about critical feedback.
Yeah.
Be specific. this behavior that you did, and this is the impact, right? Like so many high performance struggle because they say, I want feedback. And somebody says, oh, it's all good. You're doing great. There's nothing specific there. What am I doing that's great? What should I be working on? What should I be doing better? Right? Like, and since so many of us have imposter syndrome of some form or another, we think, am I really doing great? They didn't say anything in particular. They're just saying, yeah, you're fine. Like, am I?
Yeah, absolutely, Kevin. That's right on. Like, that's right on point. Like, you have to be specific with praise too, with positive feedback. Like that presentation that you put together went really, really well. I really appreciated how you covered the top 3 points that our clients needed to know, and then you answered every question like you were really on top of the material. That was fantastic. Like that's a positive example of good praise.
Okay, so critical feedback, positive feedback. Something I've been thinking about that I'd be curious your thoughts on is the sort of classic advice of the feedback sandwich. People talk about, give some praise, give a critical piece of feedback, give some praise. And I feel like there are situations in which that is the right approach, but it gets like applied to everything, and it's not clear to me that it works for everything. What's your take on it?
I think in a lot of places it's easy for that to look deceptive. And so, you start hearing the good feedback, and maybe it's something you already know, maybe something you've heard a few times. And so I think it's really tricky to deliver that in a good way. The examples I think that do work well is maybe if we go back to that, we go back to the presentation example. He outlined exactly what they've done, really specifically saying like that presentation was great. Here are all the things you did well. You talked to the main 3 points. You didn't over discuss anything. You answered the questions. And then maybe you can bring in some, like, the only thing that I would change is try to keep it down to 15 minutes or try to keep that down to 20 minutes. But everything else went really, really well. That could work pretty good where you're really building like all the things that they've done well in a really specific way. But generally, I think that like praise and feedback should be delivered separately and sort of understand and give people the opportunity to like feel the positive energy of getting praise, and then also feel also have the opportunity and the space to reflect on more constructive feedback.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And I think I was thinking about this, and I think some of it has to do with like how deep is the feedback and how deep is your relationship, right? Like the feedback sandwich idea, as you highlight, like you don't get to really feel the positive because then the critical comes, and you don't get to like really dig into the critical because then there's something, it's just distracting. I think it works really well in like a casual relationship with a peer, right? You want to give some critical feedback, but you don't have a strong relationship. And so if you were just to be critical, like it could come across very attacking. But if you're in a management relationship, you've built a relationship, or it's a peer that you have an existing relationship with, like stay focused.
Yeah, and I think the relationships, relationship building in feedback is really important. It's that support that, our brains are firing off like, oh no, I'm feeling this threat, this feedback is coming, but it's the support, it's the other, it's all the other experiences that help calm that down and help the person sort of take that in. And being able to separate those, you're not confusing things. You kind of want to be that specific, give an opportunity to the person to really sort of think about that in both scenarios.
One other thing that I've thought about some, and I'd be interested your take on is, so we tend to think positive feedback is less growth oriented. It can be growth oriented, but it's less growth oriented. And if you want to grow, you need the critical feedback. One area that I've been trying to apply more and more is positive feedback, and then sort of how you might take that to the next level, how you might grow on that or increase that. So in your example of the presentation, you did a great job of really breaking things down for clients and answering their questions well. I don't even know actually how would I take that to the next level. Let's see. If you're breaking things down really well, you say, can we apply that in other places? Or where, you've really shown a skill in this area. How might you take that and do it more?
Yeah, I think that's interesting. Like riffing on that example, and I think what you're trying to say, at least the idea that I'm getting, is that like, how do you sort of take that like positive energy that you get from the praise and help that person take that to be constructive in another part of their job?
Yes, exactly.
Which is a very, very, interesting and I think amazing strategy. In that example, I might think of like, you did that presentation really well. You focused on the main 3 points, and you came really well prepared. It'd be really great if like take that exact sort of energy and bring that to our planning session next week when we're planning the next set of features.
Yeah.
Prepare for that like a client presentation. I think it can go really, really well, really smoothly. Like you've shown that skill. Let's do it. Let's do it next week in planning with the team. So sort of taking that and situationally finding something that's similar, and then asking the person to sort of like step that up. Of course, they may already do that, but that's just an example.
They may. But yeah, finding those opportunities where the strength that you've identified, as you highlighted, turning a strength into a superpower, sometimes that's making the strength stronger. Sometimes it's finding new opportunities to apply that strength to scenarios where you may not have realized it was applicable.
Yeah, I mean, and I think if we bring it back to like the technical program, I'm just thinking about another example. You might find someone expanding into someone that maybe is like very strictly a JavaScript developer and maybe built some work for a mobile app, let's say, built it in Kotlin, started working through and sort of found the successes there and sort of encourage that person to say like, hey, you've actually picked up this other technical stack really, really quickly. Why don't we start thinking about other projects you can work on that are on different stacks and expand your skill set in that way. Instead of, and I think developers do that a lot, where it's like, I'm a React, or Node or JS full stack developer, and sort of, I don't feel comfortable moving out of that. I think that can be a really practical thing. It's like, oh, look, you've had the opportunity to learn this framework, learn these things. It looks like you're really good at quickly learning new technologies. Let's try to find new things for you to do.
Yeah. So kind of on that subject of helping people sort of bridge out from where they are, how do you think about kind of identifying sort of your values and what types of roles, what types of work, what types of tactics, or not tactics, what types of learning processes you want to do? Like, how do you think about personal growth for you?
Yeah, well, personal growth, it's a really tricky question, and I've been thinking about it for a long time, and it's still a tricky question. So one of the things that I think is important about establishing a set of values for yourself is it helps guide you through your career. It helps you understand like what's important to you, what kinds of things that you'll want to do, what kinds of things that if you do, they'll be really going up against your values, and it helps you decide like how you want to participate, what kinds of projects, what kinds of companies you want to work for, and what kinds of roles you want to have. And it's just that piece of information. Like maybe I'm looking for a new job, or maybe I'm going to apply for a promotion, or those things. Like how would that look in terms of my values? And I think a lot of companies do this. A lot of modern companies look at this. Like, here are company values. This is what we do, and this is what we don't do. And I think doing that on a personal level is really important. For me, it's something that I've gone through several times through my career, and every time it's really challenging. And I think why it's challenging is because values are inherently emotional, right? And we they're deeply emotional things, and you kind of don't even really sometimes you don't understand why, why you're upset about something. And I think as people, we have a challenging time taking emotional things and putting them into words. And so the best technique that I found is to like actually get a very large list of values, like Google, get a search result and just start looking at values and start going through like, oh, well, that's really important. Like kindness is important. Education, I think education is really important, and kind of getting a list of like a whole bunch of these sort of feelings. Empathy is important to me. Fitness. And so of course values don't have to be work related. They could be like, how do you want to sort of focus your whole life? And sometimes your work life might be taking away from a personal life value, or vice versa. You want to make sure those are all balanced. So fitness, well-being, that's those sorts of things. Eating healthy, and it kind of get that list together. And that helped me a lot, and where I had a list of like way more values that I want to manage, but I started grouping them together and like, well, actually these things are all the same, like kindness, empathy, compassion, teamwork kind of fits in there as well, right? Like working on a good team. And so coming through and start saying like, actually, belonging is important to me, being part of a good company. And you might sort of group those together and try to get things down into like, 5, 6 values that you can quickly move against. And then when you come up to a decision in the future, you can start saying like, if I move ahead with this, or if I want to make this decision, is this going to impact any one of my values? And it makes things a lot easier when you start thinking about like, are you going to be happy in your work and what you're going to do?
Yeah. Well, and so bringing it back to your JavaScript developer learning Kotlin, right? Like if their mental model of themselves was, I'm a JavaScript developer, then that's a diversion, and they're not going to want to keep doing that. But if their mental model is, I'm a UI developer, then they're going to be interested in potentially all sorts of stacks that let them develop interesting UIs. And for mobile, it's probably not going to be the same thing that it is for web and other things. And so getting clear with what is it that I care about at work. And it could be technical. In that example, it's like, this is the type of technical problem I work on. Early on, I think I was very interested in technology in and of itself, and I just wanted to learn more tech stacks. That was cool. That was fun. And at some point, for me, it shifted to actually the most important thing to me is who are the people I'm going to work with?
Right.
Who are they?
Yes. I
think there was a space in between. It was tech stacks. Then it was impact. What's our potential impact on the world? Dream big. That was big startup phase, and then bringing it back. Okay. Who are the people I get to work with day in and day out? And it sort of evolved. But each of those phases really helped change the type of work I was looking for.
That's really interesting. Like two people with a management background, I think I'm hearing some of the same things. Like my values also like belonging, connection, teamwork, building strong teams, joy in work. I think, clearly see that we've moved through a similar path.
Yeah. So you mentioned an exercise, which was kind of pulling all of the, Googling lists of values, pulling them together, seeing what resonates. And I think, as we've just highlighted, it will change over time, right? So if you've done this exercise and you're feeling like they're not resonating for you anymore, do it again. Try it. It might be different. Are there other tactics that you have used to kind of help identify for yourself what matters for you at work or outside of work?
That's been probably one of the most productive ones. I think the other thing, whether it's tactics, is paying attention to yourself, paying attention to how you feel about things. Why is it when you're working on a particular project, whether that's really positive and exciting, I'm so excited to work on this, try to verbalize that. And also maybe why you're having challenges, and sort of kind of parse out, is it like the nature of the work that you're doing, or is it just something else going on in your life that's putting you in a bad mood or something like that, and sort of try to understand that. And I think that can contribute to sort of like what's important to you and what's being taken away. Or sometimes it might be you have two values that are conflicting, right? Like you might find that you're really excited about this project, but something's that making you generally unhappy, and maybe you're just spending too much time and you're not getting that like family at home piece, or like fitness piece or something, you're taking away from another value, and it also means bringing it into balance a little bit. So yeah, paying attention to how you feel throughout, and try to put that into words.
Well, we're coming up on time. Are there any topics that you were hoping to talk about today that we have not dug into?
I don't know, what didn't we talk about? That's always it's hard to frame the negative. I think,
or alternatively, are there any topics burning in your mind right now that you'd like to discuss in our remaining time?
I think that, well, I don't know. I mean, do you have any questions for me that you still want me to sort of dive into? But I think I covered a lot of the things I wanted to talk about.
Let's see. Let me look back at my notes here. I had two questions that I had noted from a previous conversation that I'll bring up here. So one was, one of the things about a lot of engineers is that we're competitive. We want to be the best. We are pushing ourselves. Maybe we're pushing our teammates. But often the best work comes from more of a collaborative environment. So how do you kind of move, either as an individual or as a manager working with team members, help move through that competitive instinct towards a more collaborative culture?
Very, very interesting. Now, I love working collaborative cultures, and I think a little bit of competition is also healthy. But as a manager, I think it really comes back to understanding goals. Trying to have, like, I actually now remembering a scenario. I had a scenario. I had two engineers working on the back end system of a mobile project, and both of them showed a lot of promise and like moving into leadership, both very interested in that. And it became a little bit of a competition about like who's going to get to that lead role. And so trying to sort of recognize that that's happening and moving into some conversation around like, this is what our goals are. This is how we really need to work together to achieve them. Guarantee they'll find opportunities for you to take leadership within this. But when you are taking leadership, when one person's taking leadership, making sure the other person's sort of giving over that space. Lots of discussions around that, I think, is sort of important. That scenario worked out fairly well. Sort of reframing into like what we're trying to do, what we're trying to achieve, how that competitiveness is going against what we're trying to achieve. So it was a giving feedback scenario. But I think maybe if that's not happening, in general, relationship building is really important. Making sure people feel that they are on the same team, like getting people to talk to each other. I think, as we moved into a remote environment, I personally have actually worked remotely for about 10 years and managed people remotely, across the continent, remotely. And so, getting that sort of like encouraging people to say like, hey, have you had a coffee chat with this other person? Have you talked to this other person on this team? Hey, both of you are like really into this technology. Why don't you go talk about that? And I find that like encouraging that as a manager is really important, but also as a developer to sort of know that like you're going to enjoy your job better. You're going to build cooler stuff if you get really close with other people on your team. Understand them, understand what they're good at, and understand what really makes them tick, what fills their cup. It'll build that sort of collaborative environment because you start feeling like you start understanding how and who you can rely on to build cool stuff. And so one more thing that I really want to say about that point is that if you want to get to know another engineer, sure, like find hobbies, things people to do outside of work, all that advice that's standard about building relationships is good. But engineers love building code, right? It's pretty obvious, right? Talk about the work. Like I've had a few people say, I don't know what to talk about. I don't know how to get to know them. Like, talk about the work. Especially in like a client service environment, when you start pairing with engineers at a different company. Build that relationship by saying like, what's cool things that have you built? What, have you got into like the latest sort of ML stuff, or have you got into the latest iOS frameworks or whatever it is. Like, build that conversation, because I'm sure lots of people will have tons of things to say.
Well, and this ties into the other question that I wanted to ask you, which is, so having that conversation, for many of us as engineers are pretty introverted to start with. So reaching out and saying, hey, can we just hang out and talk? That feels pretty uncomfortable, but it's super valuable. So I don't remember what triggered this question, but I have it from a previous conversation, which is, what are the things that are uncomfortable? They're always uncomfortable, but that you should absolutely do anyway.
I would say, well, reach out to people. If you have a strong opinion, say it. And I think that find opportunities to take lead on things. I think those are really comfortable. You don't have to be a manager to be a leader, and in fact, there's some really great IC career paths. Moving into senior engineer staff, principal engineers, where you're not managing people, but those career paths do require leadership. Does take time to sort of talk to people, talk to larger groups, and I think you can do that slowly throughout your career. I used to be a very introverted engineer. I still internally am pretty introverted, but I'm able to, be comfortable in situations where I have conversations with people. And it starts easy. It starts with like one-on-ones, reaching out. Hey, we're going to be working on this together. Let's have a chat. That's much easier than, running Scrum. But at some point you'll get to running Scrum, and at some point it'll be like presenting your architecture. And it just starts small.
All right, that's it for this Human Skills interview. If you enjoyed it, please consider liking this video and subscribing to this channel. You can also subscribe to the Human Skills newsletter, which there's a link to right down below, to get notified of interviews like this as they come out. Take care, y'all. This is K-Ball signing out.